of human bondage. At the beginning of August, Philip passed his surgery, his last examination, and received his diploma. It was 7 years since he had entered St. Luke's Hospital. He was nearly 30. He walked down the stairs of the Royal College of Surgeons with the roll in his hand, which qualified him to practice, and his heart beat with satisfaction. Now I'm really going to begin life, he thought. Next day, he went to the secretary's office to put his name down for one of the hospital appointments. The secretary was a pleasant little man with a black beard, whom Philip had always found very affable. He congratulated him on his success, and then said, "I suppose you wouldn't like to do a locum for a month on the South Coast? 3 guineas a week with board and lodging." "I wouldn't mind," said Philip. "It's at Farnley in Dorsetshire, Dr. South. You'd have to go down at once. His assistant has developed mumps. I believe it's a very pleasant place." There was something in the secretary's manner that puzzled Philip. It was a little doubtful. "What's the crab in it?" he asked. The secretary hesitated a moment and laughed in a conciliating fashion. "Well, the fact is, I understand he's rather a crusty, funny old fellow. The agencies won't send him anyone anymore. He speaks his mind very openly, and men don't like it." "But d'you think he'll be satisfied with a man who's only just qualified? After all, I have no experience." "He ought to be glad to get you," said the secretary diplomatically. Philip thought for a moment. He had nothing to do for the next few weeks, and he was glad of the chance to earn a bit of money. He could put it aside for the holiday in Spain, which he had promised himself when he had finished his appointment at St. Luke's, or, if they would not give him anything there, at some other hospital. "All right, I'll go. The only thing is, you must go this afternoon. Will that suit you? If so, I'll send a wire at once." Philip would have liked a few days to himself, but he had seen the Athelneys the night before. He had gone at once to take them his good news, and there was really no reason why he should not start immediately. He had little luggage to pack. Soon after 7 that evening, he got out of the station at Farnley and took a cab to Dr. South's. It was a broad, low stucco house, with a Virginia creeper growing over it. He was shown into the consulting room. An old man was writing at a desk. He looked up as the maid ushered Philip in. He did not get up, and he did not speak. He merely stared at Philip. Philip was taken aback. "I think you're expecting me," he said. "The secretary of St. Luke's wired to you this morning?" "I kept dinner back for half an hour. Do you want to wash?" "I do," said Philip. Dr. South amused him by his odd manner. He got up now, and Philip saw that he was a man of middle height, thin, with white hair cut very short, and a long mouth closed so tightly that he seemed to have no lips at all. He was clean-shaven, but for small white whiskers, and they increased the squareness of face which his firm jaw gave him. He wore a brown tweed suit and a white stock. His clothes hung loosely about him, as though they had been made for a much larger man. He looked like a respectable farmer of the middle of the 19th century. He opened the door. "There is the dining room," he said, pointing to the door opposite. "Your bedroom is the first door you come to when you get on the landing. Come downstairs when you're ready." During dinner, Philip knew that Dr. South was examining him, but he spoke little, and Philip felt that he did not want to hear his assistant talk. "When were you qualified?" he asked suddenly. "Yesterday." "Were you at a university?" No. Last year, when my assistant took a holiday, they sent me a varsity man. I told him not to do it again. Too damn gentlemanly for me. There was another pause. The dinner was very simple and very good. Philip preserved a sedate exterior, but in his heart he was bubbling over with excitement. He was immensely elated at being engaged as a locum. It made him feel extremely grown up. He had an insane desire to laugh at nothing in particular, and the more he thought of his professional dignity, the more he was inclined to chuckle. But Dr. South broke suddenly into his thoughts. "How old are you?" "Getting on for 30. "How is it you're only just qualified?" "I didn't go in for the medical till I was nearly 23, and I had to give it up for 2 years in the middle." "Why?" "Poverty." Dr. South gave him an odd look and relapsed into silence. At the end of dinner, he got up from the table. "Do you know what sort of practice this is?" "No," answered Philip. "Mostly fishermen and their families. I have the Union and the Seamen's Hospital. I used to be alone here, but since they tried to make this into a fashionable seaside resort, a man is set up on the cliff, and the well-to-do people go to him. I only have those who can't afford to pay for a doctor at all." Philip saw that the rivalry was a sore point with the old man. "You know that I have no experience," said Philip. "You none of you know anything." He walked out of the room without another word and left Philip by himself. When the maid came in to clear away, she told Philip that Dr. South saw patients from 6 till 7. Work for that night was over. He soon discovered why Dr. South's assistants found it difficult to get on with him. In the first place, he set his face firmly against all the discoveries of the last 30 years. He had no patience with the drugs which became modish, were thought to work marvelous cures, and in a few years were discarded. He had stock mixtures which he had brought from St. Luke's, where he had been a student and had used all his life. He found them just as efficacious as anything that had come into fashion since. The young men who were sent down to him knew only hospital practice, and they came with the unconcealed scorn for the general practitioner which they had absorbed in the air at the hospital. But they had seen only the complicated cases which appeared in the wards. They knew how to treat an obscure disease of the suprarenal bodies, but were helpless when consulted for a cold in the head. Their knowledge was theoretical, and their self-assurance unbounded. Dr. South watched them with tightened lips. He took a savage pleasure in showing them how great was their ignorance, and how unjustified their conceit. It was a poor practice of fishing folk, and the doctor made up his own prescriptions. Dr. South asked his assistant how he expected to make both ends meet if he gave a fisherman with a stomachache a mixture consisting of half a dozen expensive drugs. He complained, too, that the young medical men were uneducated. Their reading consisted of the Sporting Times and the British Medical Journal. They could neither write a legible hand nor spell correctly. For 2 or 3 days, Dr. South watched Philip closely, ready to fall on him with acid sarcasm if he gave him the opportunity. And Philip, aware of this, went about his work with a quiet sense of amusement. He was pleased with the change of occupation. He liked the feeling of independence and of responsibility. All sorts of people came to the consulting room. He was gratified because he seemed able to inspire his patients with confidence, and it was entertaining to watch the process of cure, which at a hospital necessarily could be watched only at distant intervals. His rounds took him into low-roofed cottages in which were fishing tackle and sails, and here and there mementos of deep-sea traveling, a lacquer box from Japan, spears and oars from Melanesia, or daggers from the bazaars of Stamboul. There was an air of romance in the stuffy little rooms, and the salt of the sea gave them a bitter freshness. Philip liked to talk to the sailormen, and when they found that he was not supercilious, they told him long yarns of the distant journeys of their youth. Once or twice he made a mistake in diagnosis. He had never seen a case of measles before, and when he was confronted with the rash, took it for an obscure disease of the skin. And once or twice his ideas of treatment differed from Dr. South's. The first time this happened, Dr. South attacked him with savage irony, but Philip took it with good humor. He had some gift for repartee, and he made one or two answers which caused Dr. South to stop and look at him curiously. Philip's face was grave, but his eyes were twinkling. The old gentleman could not avoid the impression that Philip was chaffing him. He was used to being disliked and feared by his assistants, and this was a new experience. He had half a mind to fly into a passion and pack Philip off by the next train. He had done that before with his assistants. But he had an uneasy feeling that Philip then would simply laugh at him outright. And suddenly he felt amused. His mouth formed itself into a smile against his will, and he turned away. In a little while he grew conscious that Philip was amusing himself systematically at his expense. He was taken aback at first, and then diverted. "Damn his impudence," he chuckled to himself. "Damn his impudence." One evening, when Philip had reached his last week with Dr. South, a child came to the surgery door while the old doctor and Philip were making up prescriptions. It was a little ragged girl with a dirty face and bare feet. Philip opened the door. "Please, sir, will you come to Mrs. Fletcher's in Ivy Lane at once?"
"What's the matter with Mrs. Fletcher?"
called out Dr. South in his rasping voice. The child took no notice of him, but addressed herself again to Philip. "Please, sir, her little boy's had an accident, and will you come at once?"
"Tell Mrs. Fletcher I'm coming,"
called out Dr. South. The little girl hesitated for a moment, and putting a dirty finger in a dirty mouth, stood still and looked at Philip. "What's the matter, kid?" said Philip, smiling.
"Please, sir, Mrs. Fletcher says, will the new doctor come?"
There was a sound in the dispensary, and Dr. South came out into the passage.
"Isn't Mrs. Fletcher satisfied with me?" he barked. "I've attended Mrs. Fletcher since she was born. Why aren't I good enough to attend her filthy brat?"
The little girl looked for a moment as though she were going to cry. Then she thought better of it. She put out her tongue deliberately at Dr. South and, before he could recover from his astonishment, bolted off as fast as she could run. Philip saw that the old gentleman was annoyed. "You look rather fagged, and it's a goodish way to Ivy Lane," he said, by way of giving him an excuse not to go himself. Dr. South gave a low snarl.
"It's a damn sight nearer for a man who's got the use of both legs than for a man who's only got 1.5.
Philip reddened and stood silent for a while. "Do you wish me to go, or will you go yourself?" he said at last frigidly.
"What's the good of my going? They want you."
Philip took up his hat and went to see the patient. It was hard upon 8 o'clock when he came back. Dr. South was standing in the dining room with his back to the fireplace.
"You've been a long time," he said.
"I'm sorry. Why didn't you start dinner?"
"Because I chose to wait. Have you been all this while at Mrs. Fletcher's?"
"No, I'm afraid I haven't. I stopped to look at the sunset on my way back, and I didn't think of the time." Dr. South did not reply, and the servant brought in some grilled sprats. Philip ate them with an excellent appetite. Suddenly, Dr. South shot a question at him. "Why did you look at the sunset?" Philip answered with his mouth full. "Because I was happy." Dr. South gave him an odd look, and the shadow of a smile flickered across his old, tired face. They ate the rest of the dinner in silence, but when the maid had given them the port and left the room, the old man leaned back and fixed his sharp eyes on Philip. "It stung you up a bit when I spoke of your game leg, young fellow," he said. "People always do, directly or indirectly, when they get angry with me. I suppose they know it's your weak point." Philip faced him and looked at him steadily. "Are you very glad to have discovered it?" The doctor did not answer, but he gave a chuckle of bitter mirth. They sat for a while staring at one another. Then Dr. South surprised Philip extremely. "Why don't you stay here, and I'll get rid of that damned fool with his mumps?" "It's very kind of you, but I hope to get an appointment at the hospital in the autumn. It'll help me so much in getting other work later." "I'm offering you a partnership," said Dr. South grumpily. "Why?" asked Philip with surprise. "They seem to like you down here." "I didn't think that was a fact which altogether met with your approval," Philip said dryly. "Do you suppose that after 40 years' practice, I care a two-penny damn whether people prefer my assistant to me? No, my friend. There's no sentiment between my patients and me. I don't expect gratitude from them. I expect them to pay my fees. Well, what'd you say to it?" Philip made no reply, not because he was thinking over the proposal, but because he was astonished. It was evidently very unusual for someone to offer a partnership to a newly qualified man, and he realized with wonder that, although nothing would induce him to say so, Dr. South had taken a fancy to him. He thought how amused the secretary at St. Luke's would be when he told him. "The practice brings in about $700 a year. We can reckon out how much your share would be worth, and you can pay me off by degrees. And when I die, you can succeed me. I think that's better than knocking about hospitals for 2 or 3 years, and then taking assistantships until you can afford to set up for yourself." Philip knew it was a chance that most people in his profession would jump at. The profession was overcrowded, and half the men he knew would be thankful to accept the certainty of even so modest a competence as that. "I'm awfully sorry, but I can't," he said. "It means giving up everything I've aimed at for years. In one way and another, I've had a roughish time, but I always had that one hope before me, to get qualified so that I might travel. And now, when I wake in the morning, my bones simply ache to get off. I don't mind where particularly, but just away, to places I've never been to." Now the goal seemed very near. He would have finished his appointment at St. Luke's by the middle of the following year, and then he would go to Spain. He could afford to spend several months there, rambling up and down the land which stood to him for romance. After that, he would get a ship and go to the East. Life was before him, and time of no account. He could wander, for years if he chose, in unfrequented places, amid strange peoples, where life was led in strange ways. He did not know what he sought, or what his journeys would bring him, but he had a feeling that he would learn something new about life, and gain some clue to the mystery that he had solved, only to find more mysterious. And even if he found nothing, he would allay the unrest which gnawed at his heart. But Dr. South was showing him a great kindness, and it seemed ungrateful to refuse his offer for no adequate reason. So, in his shy way, trying to appear as matter-of-fact as possible, he made some attempt to explain why it was so important to him to carry out the plans he had cherished so passionately. Dr. South listened quietly, and a gentle look came into his shrewd old eyes. It seemed to Philip an added kindness that he did not press him to accept his offer. Benevolence is often very peremptory. He appeared to look upon Philip's reasons as sound. Dropping the subject, he began to talk of his own youth. He had been in the Royal Navy, and it was his long connection with the sea that, when he retired, had made him settle at Farnley. He told Philip of old days in the Pacific, and of wild adventures in China. He had taken part in an expedition against the headhunters of Borneo, and had known Samoa when it was still an independent state. He had touched at Coral Islands. Philip listened to him entranced. Little by little he told Philip about himself. Dr. South was a widower. His wife had died 30 years before, and his daughter had married a farmer in Rhodesia. He had quarreled with him, and she had not come to England for 10 years. It was just as if he had never had wife or child. He was very lonely. His gruffness was little more than a protection which he wore to hide a complete disillusionment. And to Philip it seemed tragic to see him just waiting for death, not impatiently, but rather with loathing for it, hating old age, and unable to resign himself to its limitations, and yet with the feeling that death was the only solution of the bitterness of his life. Philip crossed his path, and the natural affection which long separation from his daughter had killed. She had taken her husband's part in the quarrel, and her children he had never seen, settled itself upon Philip. At first it made him angry. He told himself it was a sign of dotage. But there was something in Philip that attracted him, and he found himself smiling at him, he knew not why. Philip did not bore him. Once or twice he put his hand on his shoulder. It was as near a caress as he had got since his daughter left England so many years before. When the time came for Philip to go, Dr. South accompanied him to the station. He found himself unaccountably depressed. "I've had a ripping time here," said Philip. "You've been awfully kind to me."
I suppose you're very glad to go?
"I've enjoyed myself here."
But you want to get out into the world. Ah, you have youth.
He hesitated a moment.
I want you to remember that if you change your mind, my offer still stands.
"That's awfully kind of you." Philip shook hands with him out of the carriage window, and the train steamed out of the station. Philip thought of the fortnight he was going to spend in the hop field. He was happy at the idea of seeing his friends again, and he rejoiced because the day was fine. But Dr. South walked slowly back to his empty house. He felt very old and very lonely.